one moment. All right, without further ado, we are delighted to have Stephen Basdeo, whom I've been talking about and whose first two chapters of his book on Robin Hood you have read. Stephen Basdeo is a historian who has specialized in the history of crime, and more especially, the history of crime literature. Originally, he began by studying portrayals of 18th century highwaymen before completing a PhD thesis on 18th and 19th century Robin Hood books, which combined close readings of several texts, as well as a consideration of them as commodities first. He has since branched out into examinations of the lives of medieval heroes, such as Wat Tyler, and unrelated to Robin Hood, he's currently writing a monograph on Victorian novelist and journalist George W.M. Reynolds. On a personal note, I discovered Stephen Basdeo's writings, and they were all available on the internet about 4 or 5 years ago. And ever since, I've been drawing on his work for my teaching off and research into Robin Hood. So without further ado, I'll let Stephen Basdeo take over.
Thank you, Arvind, and thank you for having me, everyone. So I will just share my screen. So can you all see a PowerPoint?
Yes, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, well, I shall begin. So today's story of Robin Hood does not begin in the medieval period, as one might expect, but in late 18th century London. The rapid improvement and expansion of the city, gilded with a neoclassical facade, masked a great many social problems. Poverty was rife. A great majority of the population lived in rickety slum houses, all they could afford on their low wages, with poor sanitation and ventilation. Little wonder then that 340 out of every 1,000 children died before their first birthday, or that life expectancy was a mere 41 years. Across the Channel, the worst excesses of the French Revolution and its reign of terror had come to an end. But a world war was raging in 1794. Britain, her colonies, and her European allies and their colonies had declared war on revolutionary France and its colonies. Except for a temporary truce in 1802, the war would continue until 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. In Britain, there were a great many radicals who sympathized with the French revolutionaries, and they desired that this, quote, regeneration of humanity would spread to Britain. British radicals hoped for the foundation of a republic on their shores, but would be arranged along the lines of those set forth in the writings of Thomas Paine. In response, the British government, led by Pitt the Younger, began to crack down on homegrown radicals' activities by suspending habeas corpus and curtailing people's freedom of assembly and freedom of the press. These measures came to be known as Pitt's Terror, an ironic reference to the French reign of terror. In the opinion of the historian Robert Reed, so repressive did the British government become during the French Revolution. During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, that it became closer in spirit to the Third Reich than at any other time in its history. It is in our brief foray into 18th century London that we make the acquaintance of a middle-aged attorney named Joseph Ritson, who lived at 8 Holborn Court, Gray's Inn. In his leisure time, Ritson was an antiquarian scholar and had, by 1794, published several anthologies of Old and Middle English poetry. Ritson was one of those radicals targeted by Pitt, and there were several moments during the 1790s that he felt his life and liberty were at stake, owing to the fact that his correspondence with like-minded citizen friends was likely being monitored by the Pitt government's agents. So Ritson needed an outlet to express his revolutionary sympathies somewhere. In the end, he gathered all of the materials he had researched on one particular anti-establishment medieval British figure and published a book about him. The man he was researching, of course, was Robin Hood, and the book that Ritson published was Robin Hood, a collection of all the ancient poems, songs, and ballads. The title of Ritson's book seemed like a dry scholarly anthology, but this was certainly not the case. As one turns the pages of Ritson's little 2-volume work, the picture of Robin Hood that emerges is one of a revolutionary, almost a medieval Thomas Paine. According to Ritson, Robin Hood was a man who, in a barbarous age and under a complicated tyranny, displayed a spirit of freedom and independence, which has endeared him to the common people, whose cause he maintained, for all opposition to tyranny is the cause of the people, and, in spite of the malicious endeavours of pitiful monks, by whom history was consecrated to the crimes and follies of titled ruffians and sainted idiots, to suppress all record of his patriotic exertions and virtuous acts, will render his name immortal. Yet Ritson did something more. He made the search for a real Robin Hood matter. Ritson wrote a biography of this medieval outlaw, formed of sources he had collected from medieval chronicles, poetry, plays, and out of these concluded that Robin Hood was born around 1160, was outlawed for debt, died around 1247, having been murdered by the prioress of Kirklees. Prior to Ritson's book, Robin was either a violent criminal, as he is portrayed in medieval poetry often, or largely a figure of fun, as he was depicted in early modern ballads. Very few people before Ritson, it's fair to say, cared whether Robin Hood was real or not. Ritson, whose book was reprinted many times throughout the 19th and even into the 20th century, made people care. As a result, Ritson initiated the modern study of Robin Hood. Following in Ritson's footsteps then, what we will discuss today are the origins of the legend, a look at the most likely real Robin Hood candidate, the origin and significance of the medieval Robin Hood texts, thereby refreshing some of the information you have probably read already from my book and other sources. And then briefly, we'll look at some of the key critical themes underlying Robin Hood's representation in post-medieval British popular culture. So, where does the real Robin Hood begin? Where does Robin Hood begin? When does the real figure emerge in history? And when do stories about him begin to appear? Now, I should say it's very flattering that some of you have read my book, but I must confess it's been superseded a little bit by two very recent scholarly works which have come out. David Crook's Robin Hood, Legend and Reality, published this year, and Leslie Coote's Story Worlds of Robin Hood, published late in 2020. And some of their conclusions deserve an in-depth discussion here. Both of these scholars have pinpointed the emergence of the legend to the early 13th century. We'll discuss Crook and Coote's work in a moment, but suffice it to say for now that they're pinpointing the legend's origins in the early 13th century tallies, interestingly, with the appearance of a man, a fugitive named Robin Hood, who appears in the York Assize rolls for the years 1225 to 26. As many of you who have completed the set reading will know, there are in fact a number of candidates who have been posited as the real Robin Hood over time. In the 1930s, an archivist found a reference to a man named Robert Hood in those aforementioned York Assize rolls. This Robert Hood was listed as fugitive and seemed like a worthy candidate for a historical outlaw, especially in view of the fact that he was a fugitive because he was in debt to the liberty of St. Peter's in York. This would have made this Robin a tenant of the Archbishop of York, who was, of course, one of Robin's enemies in the poem A Jest of Robin Hood. David Crook later argued that this Robert Hood was the same as Robert of Wetherby from later in the 1220s, who was described as outlaw and evildoer of our land. Further facts seemed to fall into place. As I mentioned in the book, the man charged with hunting down this Robert Hood was a man named Eustace of Loudon, the High Sheriff of York, whose previous occupation, prior to taking up his appointment at York, however, was Deputy High Sheriff of Nottingham. This perhaps explains why too, but although the Robin Hood poems base him primarily in Barnsdale, he was pursued by the Sheriff of Nottingham. So the vague biography seemed to emerge from of this Robert Hood's life, and made sense with the reputed date of Robin Hood's death in 1247, and followed these circumstances, listed as an outlaw in the 1190s, according to some chroniclers. Still an outlaw in 1225 when he appears in the assize records. And during this time, he was pursued by the Sheriff of York, who was actually the Sheriff of Nottingham, and he had died by 1247. His notoriety would then have been sufficient for his life story to acquire semi-legendary status by 1262, when another man named William, who had also been outlawed, assumed the alias of William Robber Hood. The discovery of the 1225 candidate has meant that all the other candidates put forward by scholars since the 19th century have become a bit redundant. One of those whom we can now discount was the so-called Robert Hood of Wakefield, identified by a Victorian antiquary named Joseph Hunter. Hunter was appointed as the assistant record keeper of the Public Record Office, or National Archives as we know it today. And in a tract published in 1852, he argued that Robert Hood was from Wakefield. Hunter's Robin Hood, along with his wife Matilda, appears in the court rolls of the Manor of Wakefield in 1316 and 1317. Without any evidence, Hunter also argued that this Robert Hood became an outlaw in 1316, between 1316 and 1324, when Hunter discovered that there was a valet de chambre to Edward II named Robin Hood. This seemed to confirm that this man was the same Robin Hood who enters into the king's service at the end of the 15th century poem Jest of Robin Hood, when the king travels into the forest and meets Robin and asks him to join his service. Other potential candidates include a Robert Hood from Cirencester, who sometime between 1215 and 1216 murdered a man in a local abbot's garden. Some people think that this 1215 man renders the 1225 Robert Hood redundant, and that the Cirencester candidate's existence somehow proves that Robin Hood was just an alias all along. But I think this is the wrong approach. First, the 1215 Robert Hood was not an outlaw or fugitive, but a murderer, and murderers, then or now, rarely get public acclaim. What the existence of this man tells us is not that Robin Hood was an alias as early as 1215. It simply says that there were other people with a similar name in existence. In fact, I think we hold evidence for a real Robin Hood, to a higher standard than we would for other historical criminals. For example, one of the other bandits that I've studied in the past was Jack Sheppard, a notorious 18th century boy criminal who died in 1724. There was only one Jack Sheppard, whose life story was told over and over again by ballad writers and novelists, but there are in fact a lot of Jack Sheppards in Georgia and London, many of whom even appeared as criminals in the Old Bailey, and no one would doubt the existence of a real Jack Sheppard just because other people so named were found to be living there at the time. And in 1354, there was a Robert Hood who was incarcerated in Rockingham jail for forest offences, but this man is much too late to be taken seriously as a candidate for the real Robin Hood. So the 1225 man provides the genesis of the outlaw's origins. By the mid-1200s, people were appropriating the outlaw's name of Robin Hood, or it was being applied to them. And yet, there is no evidence that the 1225 outlaw was an outlaw who lived in the forest. A statement by R.B. Dobson and J. Taylor, and which David Crook has recently confirmed, is that by a now familiar paradox, the genesis of the most famous forest outlaw in English literature seems to lie in the exploits of a strong thief of Basdeo, who may not even have been an outlaw, and who apparently had little connection with the forest in any sense of the ambiguous word. On the central question of how the highwayman of Basdeo was transformed into a transmutable forest outlaw, the available evidence continues to remain obstinately imprecise. Indeed, even the first reference to Robin Hood in the cultural source does not state explicitly that Robin was a forest outlaw. For this we turn to William Langland's Piers Plowman, written in the 1370s. In that text, a lazy priest states that I know not perfectly my paternoster as the priest it sings, but I know rhymes of Robin Hood and Randolph, Earl of Chester. As you can see, there is no mention of a forest here. It seems obvious that he is an outlaw, that Robin Hood is an outlaw, as he's connected with Randolph, Earl of Chester, but not all outlaws lived in the forest, and it's not indicated here. The rural connections of Robin Hood probably began, as Leslie Coote argues, in the genre of French pastorelles, a major text of this genre being Adam Lahal's Jeux de Robin et Marion, pardon my horrible French pronunciation there, written around 1282. There was, of course, much intercultural exchange between England and France during the 1200s and 1300s, and Lahal's play, and several plays in this pastorelle genre, are the first to connect two figures named Robin and Marion, although they are not outlaw plays, importantly. The Robin of the pastorelles is also of relatively low social status and can be seen leading peasants in country dances along the edge of the forest. Performed in England and France, these plays, so Leslie Coote argues, likely formed the basis of the English Robin Hood May Games, which featured Maid Marian, that we have evidence of in the 15th century. With Robin Hood's ascension to the status of English cultural icon complete by the 13th century, medieval chroniclers soon began paying attention to this quote-unquote historical man. The Scots chronicler Andrew of Wintoun remarked on the existence of Little John and Robin Hood. Waif men were commended good in Inglewood and Barnsdale. They ossit all this time their travail. Wintoun therefore places the outlaws along the Cheshire-Lancashire border and in Barnsdale in Yorkshire. Robin is still, however, not quite in the forest yet. We know he is a highwayman, waifman of popular culture, but he's not yet in the forest. Although Inglewood is called Inglewood, it wasn't actually a forest, but a large tract of rural areas set aside for hunting, in which there were some pockets of wooded areas. It's not until 1440 that a chronicler places Robin Hood and his men specifically in a woodland area. That chronicler was Walter Bower, who stated that during the rebellion of Simon de Montfort in 1265 to 63, getting my dates wrong there, there arose from among the disinherited and outlaws that most famous armed robber, Robert Hood, along with Little John and their accomplices. Robert Hood was an outlaw amongst the woodland briars and thorns. Finally, Robin Hood is in the forest. But why has Bower placed these criminals in the woodland briars and thorns? Well, he goes on to tell us that this information comes from the comedies and tragedies sung by jesters and bards, and that these silly tales, as he calls them, were particularly well liked by the common folk. So let's look at some of these silly tales. Or not so silly, to be honest. So, as we mentioned, the earliest reference to tales of Robin Hood in popular culture appears in the aforementioned B text of William Langland's Piers Plowman, written around 1377. Maurice Keene states that the rhymes of Robin Hood to which Langland refers would originally have been short, simple refrains of no more than a few lines, perhaps something relatively unremarkable, such as Robin Hood in Greenwood stood. Over time, short choruses would have been added to by different people until they evolved into fully fledged narratives. There are four what we would call early narrative texts which tell a more or less full story of Robin Hood, which have all been dated with some precision by Thomas Olgren. And these are Robin Hood and the Monk, a manuscript of which dates to 1465, Robin Hood and the Potter, dating to 1468, A Jest of Robin Hood, the earliest surviving copy of which dates to 1495. The Jest in particular seems to have been a compilation of several different Robin Hood tales, which someone has bound together at some point. But there is another text which I personally would include in the corpus of early texts, but which some Robin Hood scholars are reluctant to include sometimes. And this is Robin Hood and Guy of Gisborne, the story of which dates to the late 1400s, but which was written down in the late 17th century. To these four bona fide Robin Hood texts, we might add two more, Robin and Gandlin and the Tale of Gamlin. However, these are sometimes not included by scholars in the corpus of Robin Hood texts because they're not explicitly about Robin Hood. Now, I'm not going to regurgitate the stories of these texts. I want you to have fun and get to know them yourselves. They shouldn't take you too long to read, and I do recommend reading them in the Middle English. You might struggle, but do persist because it's quite fun. What I do want to do is introduce you to some of the scholarly debates surrounding the text.
Stephen, they've actually read the text, all of them.
Oh, yeah. That is brilliant. But
in the Middle English.
Oh, that is wonderful. And I wish all my students were as studious and had done all the readings in advance like you wonderful people have. But I mean, so some of this may be familiar from the book you've read, but it was actually a scholarly debate surrounding the nature and, importantly, audience of the early medieval texts, which effectively kick-started the modern academic study of the Robin Hood legend. And this debate began when the neo-Marxist historian Rodney Hilton published an article in Past and Present in the 1950s. Now, until Thomas Olgren's more precise dating of the early texts to the late 15th century in the early 2000s when he published his book, historians before that, since the Victorian era, had assumed that Robin Hood and the Monk, Robin Hood and the Potter, and A Jest of Robin Hood all dated from the very early 1400s, quote, if not before, end quote. It had been assumed by Rodney Hilton that the early poems of Robin Hood were an expression of peasant discontent during the later 14th century, the era of the so-called Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Hilton's argument seemed a bit too far-fetched for James C. Holt, who hit back at Hilton's argument and countered that there is nothing in the early text to suggest that Robin Hood was at all interested in the problems of the peasants. As Holt further argued, there is little in any of these early texts that indicates Robin Hood is concerned with the problems of the people at large. Robin certainly did not steal from the rich and redistribute their wealth to the destitute, and the texts are not expressions of peasant discontent. A.J. Pollard has already provided a further critique of Hilton's argument. Pollard stated that the idea that early Robin Hood texts were a critique of feudalism and expression of peasant discontent is wrong because even by 1300s, England was not a feudal or peasant society in any meaningful sense, even when we consider the various debates attached to the meaning of that term. But let me allow Pollard to speak for himself, and this is probably quite a useful quote if you want to consider the social context in which these Robin Hood tales were produced. Pollard says, the rural economy was commercialised. Countrymen had moved away from simple self-sufficiency by 1200, and by the end of the 13th century were producing for sale on a considerable scale. Rural society had ceased to be a peasant society only when market production dominated over subsistence production. By 1300, England had undoubtedly reached a high degree of commercial development. It was already a highly urbanized society. Might it not, therefore, be more appropriate to describe England as already a capitalist economy, characterized by the operation of market forces, the dominance of consumer demand, new investment, specialization and concentration of industry? It may not have been a fully fledged capitalist economy, but the transition was well underway. This is not to say, of course, that there were absolutely no peasants in 15th century England. That would be the wrong message to take away. We know that there were, in fact, even into the 18th century, families who rented land from a local magnate and farmed primarily for subsistence and who paid rent in either in kind or in money. What is in question is the extent to which England in the 15th century was a peasant society. But moving on from that, if we view the world of the Jest and other Robin Hood texts not as a product of feudal society, but as a product of early capitalist society, then Holt's arguments perhaps become even more compelling. We find that Robin Hood's social status is that of a yeoman, a small landowner. For a yeoman, as A.J. Pollard points out, was a member of the medieval middle classes, or the medieval middling sort, and the people who read or heard the early Robin Hood text would have recognised that. The people who Robin does help in the text are not from the lower classes at all, but of a higher rank. In the Jest, he lends money to a poor knight. In Robin Hood and the Potter, he compensates the Potter for the money that he has lost. And in Robin Hood and the Monk, the outlaw does not help anyone significant financially at all, but it has to be rescued by Little John from the sheriff. In these stories, Robin is kind to the poor if he meets with them, but they are not his main concern. Perhaps the fact that Robin Hood emerged at a moment when capitalism was in the ascendant accounts for the fact that he has always fitted well into post-medieval anti-capitalist discourse. Part of the problem with Rodney Hilton's approach is the fact that he assumed that all of the medieval texts formed a single corpus of homogeneous audience of listeners and a single corpus of text. Others, such as Thomas Olgren, thought that the clue to identifying the audience of the Robin Hood tales, and therefore of understanding them more fully, lies in recovering the social status of the people who recorded the text for posterity. The owner of the manuscript containing the text of Robin Hood and the Monk, for example, was Gilbert Pilkington, a clergyman from Lichfield. The manuscript of Robin Hood and the Potter was owned by a man named Richard Cole, who was, like Robin Hood, a yeoman. These texts may have been owned by yeomen and clergymen, but Olgren had further thoughts on who they were really written for. Just like Holt argued, Olgren stated that the poems were for an urban audience. But Olgren went further, and picking up on a passage in the Jest, where the measuring and selling of cloth is parodied, concluded that the poem was commissioned by the Merchant Tailors Association. Thus, the Robin Hood early text should, according to Olgren, also be seen in the context of a transition from feudalism to capitalism, when the guilds were appropriating the customs of the upper classes. Personally, although Olgren's discussion of the owners of the original manuscripts is second to none, I find the Merchant Tailors argument based on a single passage of text unconvincing, but you people may have a different view on this. Although Olgren is broadly correct, I should, in my opinion, state that the text should be viewed in the context of the transition to capitalism. There are some scholars, however, who refuse to identify any specific social context. Instead, they argue that the text represents a very generalized and quite vaguely defined, quote, dream of resistance to unjust authority. Such is the position of Stephen Knight, which is not wrong, for the texts, of course, do celebrate outlaws who are hardly the state's best friends. But for Pollard, the key debate is, are the texts subversive or do they affirm the social order? There is nothing in any of the texts to suggest that Robin Hood wants to change the social order. The fact that Robin helps a poor knight and pledges loyalty to the king in the Jest suggests that he's just fine with the prevailing hierarchy. Even if Olgren is correct, and the texts were commissioned by and for a limited audience of merchants originally, this does not preclude the possibility that commoners could have heard such tales in other social settings. As we see soon, one manner in which the poorer classes could have encountered the stories of the ballads, if not the ballads and poems themselves, was in Robin Hood village plays and May Day games. So clearly no single audience can be attributed to the early rhymes of Robin Hood, and the fact that Robin Hood and the Monk was owned by a clergyman is surprising when the clergy as a whole receive a negative reputation in the Monk. Robin Hood, even at this early stage, it seems, was all things to all men. Everyone could enjoy his story, whether the listener was rich or poor, noble or serf. Another major debate, however, is the extent to which the poems, which some like Maurice Keene preferred to call ballads, were actually popular, regardless of whether one thinks they affirm or challenge the existing social order. The manuscript tales like Robin Hood and the Monk and Robin Hood and the Potter may have been based on previous oral tales which circulated prior to them being written down, but whether these were ever seen in their written form or heard in their oral form by anyone else other than the manuscript owners is hard to determine. The Jest of Robin Hood, which survives only in printed form, was first published only in 1495 and was likely the preserve of specialist and literate collectors. So we don't really know the extent of the poem's reach. For sure, Piers Plowman makes reference to certain rhymes of Robin Hood, although as we have seen from Maurice Keene's remarks about the origins of the poems or ballads, these likely began as simple refrains rather than full-length narratives. How then might the people at large have encountered the tales of Robin Hood? Well, Stephen Knight suggests that this came in the form of the aforementioned village plays, which were likely more widespread and well known than the poems themselves. There are 3 extant plays. Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham can be dated to 1473 and is referenced in a letter from John Paston in the same year. William Copland's printed edition of the Jest contains an appendix titled The Play of Robin Hood, very proper to be played in May games. The Copland edition that has survived is incomplete, but also contains an almost complete version of the text of a play titled Robin Hood and the Friar, as well as the fragment of another play, obviously based upon the story of Robin Hood and the Potter. Robin Hood plays were still popular among village audiences during Henry VIII's time, when in 1549, Bishop Latimer related how he once visited a village to preach a sermon, only to find the church doors locked. As Latimer says, he found that someone said to him, "Sir, this is a busy day with us. We cannot hear you. It is Robin Hood's day. The parish are gone abroad to gather for Robin Hood. I pray you let them not." And then Latimer continues, "I was fain there to give place to Robin Hood. It is no laughing matter to prefer Robin Hood before the ministration of God's word. This realm have been ill provided for, that it have such corrupt judgments in it, to prefer Robin Hood to God's word." Even Henry VIII himself was fond of dressing up as Robin Hood on occasion, further confirming Pollard's thesis, perhaps, that Robin Hood was all things to all men. The village plays were often charity events where money was raised for a good cause. And Stephen Knight speculates that it is probably here, and I tend to agree with him on this, but it was probably in these plays that the idea that Robin Hood steals from the rich and gives to the poor was first born. And of course, that is perhaps one of the key tropes which has stayed with us down into modern portrayals. Robin Hood and the Monk and Robin Hood and the Potter, the manuscripts, were likely quickly forgotten and not rediscovered until Joseph Ritson conducted research for both his Robin Hood book in 1795 and his Bibliographia Poetica in 1802. The Jest of Robin Hood was first printed in 1495 and reprinted several times, once in 1510, another time by Wynkyn de Worde between 1492 and 1534. Richard Pinson printed an edition of the Jest before 1530, and William Copland printed an edition around 1560. It is the Jest of Robin Hood, which you can see on the screen here, and not Robin Hood and the Monk or Robin Hood and the Potter, which represent Robin as the quintessential good outlaw. But the century in which the Jest was reprinted also witnessed the birth of a new kind of criminal in popular culture and the birth of the idea of an underworld. The new criminal was the rogue, and these rogues, they did not live apart from society like the Greenwood outlaws of the past did. Instead, in literature, they were portrayed as being part of society, more menacing because they were indistinguishable from the law-abiding. They were indiscriminate as well with regard to whom they targeted, and they felt no compunction in targeting men or women. So perhaps nostalgia and a fear of the new urban criminal then accounts for the idealization of the good outlaw in 16th century print culture. And we see in the 16th century not only the several reprints of the Jest, but also the first printings of the other good outlaw poem, Adam Bell, Clym of the Clough, and William of Cloudsley. Now that's just a bit of speculation on my part, but I do think it leads us nicely into a discussion of one of the key concepts in post-medieval, one of the key critical themes, in the post-medieval Robin Hood tradition. And this is that of gentrification, which allegedly occurred, according to Stephen Knight, from the 16th to the 19th century. Now, Knight does not clearly define the meaning of gentrification in relation to the Robin Hood tradition in his book, Robin Hood, A Mythic Biography. So it's really left to us, I think, to try and first define what Knight might mean, looking at both his writings and other scholars who have used it since. So let us attempt a definition. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it's a good place to start, one meaning of gentrification is, quote, the process of making a person or activity more refined or polite, end quote. Existing scholarship appears to require that Robin Hood be portrayed as an earl, as the Earl of Huntingdon usually, for him to be considered gentrified, although I would add a moral dimension to this definition when applying it to Robin Hood. He is required to be noble in both birth and character. Knight argues that, as Robin Hood was appropriated by elite writers and elevated to the peerage in his portrayals, Robin appearing as he does in Anthony Munday's two plays, The Downfall of Robert Earl of Huntingdon and The Death of Robert Earl of Huntingdon as a lord, so Robin Hood became a figure that was acceptable to the upper classes. In these plays, Robin Hood was no longer a violent yeoman whose men killed defenseless page boys as they do in Robin Hood and the Monk. Instead, he was genteel. The sentence of outlawry was passed upon him, not because he had ever done anything truly bad, but because, like many an aristocrat, he had fallen into debt. It is unclear whether Munday's plays were ever performed to a wide audience, and evidence suggests that they were not. The dissemination of the Robin as Earl plot was left to the ballad writer Martin Parker and his True Tale of Robin Hood, published in 1631. And of course, the depiction of Robin Hood as an aristocrat has lasted in most portrayals down to the 20th century. And in this gentrified tradition, according to Stephen Knight, falls every text in which Robin Hood is an aristocrat. That's certainly a broad range of texts, and I think we can critique, with the greatest respect to him, his argument. In my opinion, the concept of gentrification works well if you are a literary critic studying the text and the text only. For Munday's case, whose Robin Hood plays were likely never performed, this is perhaps appropriate. But I personally think that Knight has too literary a focus and often pays less attention to the wider context in which the texts were produced, a fact evident in his statement about earlier Robin Hood texts encompassing a vague dream of resistance. The gentrification case becomes more complicated when we consider two things: mode of transmission and social and political context. There can often be a tension between the representation of Robin Hood in the text and its mode of transmission, and each of these, when viewed in their context, can seriously undermine Knight's gentrification thesis. Discussions of gentrification taken up by later scholars, in fact, sometimes have a tendency to verge on the Whiggish. Robin starts out in medieval texts a bold, often violent and murderous outlaw, before he is appropriated in the late 16th century by Anthony Munday as a moral and upright lord. These types of depictions continue through to the 19th century, as Robin Hood supposedly becomes the epitome of the English gentleman. But the depiction of Robin Hood as an earl does not always mean that it is a conservative, safe, or non-violent version of the legend. So I'm going to discuss briefly a couple of case studies. If we examine Walter Scott's brilliant novel Ivanhoe, the case becomes much more complicated when we examine the three factors I mentioned above: mode of transmission, social and cultural context, and text. Scott's novel was originally published as a three-volume novel by Ballantyne & Co. It was expensive. It would have set a purchaser back 31 shillings and 6 on its first release. To put that in context, it should be noted that the average weekly wage of a working class labourer was but 9 shillings a week. The working classes did not read this on its first release, though they may have seen some of the cheaper theatrical adaptations. But we have, in a 31 shilling 6 three-volume novel, if not a gentrified mode of transmission, at least a very bourgeois one. Yet Robin Hood himself in that text is not a lord, but a yeoman. So then, there's already complications for the idea of gentrification. But let's take another example. Pierce Egan's novel Robin Hood and Little John, or The Merry Men of Sherwood Forest, which was serialized in between 1838 and 1840. This is truly one of my favorites, and it was one of the biggest selling, if not one of the biggest selling Robin Hood novels of the 19th century. But it was also one of the controversial Penny Dreadful novels, novels that were serialized weekly and sold for working classes for a penny, hardly a gentrified format, and which were the bane of Victorian moralists who worried that the working classes' morals were being corrupted by salacious material. The author, Pierce Egan, and his novels were actually denounced by Victorian reviewers who said that of his novels, lust was the alpha and murder the omega of all of them. If we look closely at the text itself, it's quite violent. The illustrations which Egan himself drew for the novel show arrows flying into people's eyes, and there's a number of attempted rapes. Robin Hood in this text is a lord, yet he is also politically radical. Produced to coincide with the beginning of the pro-democracy Chartist movement in Britain, we find Robin Hood fighting for the political rights of the people. The Victorian establishment certainly took a dim view of the Chartist movement and even sought to suppress it. These are, of course, just two case studies out of a number of possible ones I could choose from a post-medieval tradition. Should you have the option of devising your own essay or research questions for your assignments, one possible avenue you might take is to choose a Robin Hood text, perhaps from a corpus of 16th or 17th century texts, and see if it matches Knight's gentrification thesis. And certainly the rules we have just applied to Egan's text might also apply to Joseph Ritson's. Ritson's 2-volume work, retailed at 12 shillings, so fairly expensive, printed by Thomas Egerton and sold in beautiful leather boards. It was beautifully illustrated by the famous Buick firm of engravers, whose illustrations made Robin Hood appear more like a rustic Mr. Darcy than the bold outlaw of the jest. Its limited print run of just over 100 copies ensured that it was found only in the stockrooms of the upper middle class and aristocratic subscription libraries, or in the private libraries of wealthy gentlemen like Walter Scott, whose personal copy of Ritson's Robin Hood is still on display, where he left it in the Abbotsford Library. Yet the actual portrayal of Robin Hood in Ritson's text as a medieval Thomas Paine and freedom fighter who, quote, set kings, judges and magistrates at defiance, end quote, is surely at odds with the small c conservative notion of gentrification. Of course, my own issues with the idea of gentrification might spur some of your fresh minds to either agree or disagree with Knight, Algren or Holt, as the case may be. As you can see, in Robin Hood studies especially, it is these dialogues between scholars that have advanced our understanding. So I would like to leave you with some general guidelines for studying Robin Hood. Obviously analyze the text, but also consider audience of the text and the mode of its transmission. Combine your literary analysis with a sound knowledge of English history during the period in which the texts were produced. Be brave and critique or challenge existing scholars. But whatever conclusions you reach in your own analysis of the text, and regardless of whether Robin Hood was a real person or not, the fact that you are even studying Robin Hood, where you are, in a country far removed from old merry England, perhaps illustrates the legend's longevity and makes it quite special. So perhaps in conclusion, we can end with a few lines from Michael Drayton, who said, "In this our spacious isle, I think there is not one, but he of Robin Hood hath heard, and of Little John. And to the end of times, the tale shall ne'er be done, of Scarlett, George Green, and much the miller's son, of Tuck, the merry friar, who many a sermon made, in praise of Robin Hood, the outlaws, and their trade." Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Give you a hand. Let me just, thank you very much. And I'm just gonna, okay, they're all clapping. That's good because some of my students here in class. And I'm gonna, okay, we'll open it up for the Q&A. And Stephen, I suppose you have some time for that? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see how I can unpin you. I'll remove, okay, that'll make it much easier. It's not happening here. Sorry, gallery. All right, much better now. I cannot see all of, I mean, I can see one page populated with images, So without, again, further ado, if anyone wants to go first with a question, perhaps he or she can pose it. And Stephen, I think it's probably 11 o'clock right now, isn't it? At your end, or almost 11. So,
Yeah.
all right, anyone wants to just go ahead and open your mouth and they're all very shy, I think. It's very hard to believe that.
Well, I did
Yeah.
I wondered if because obviously I did receive some wonderful questions. Now I was going to say obviously what I'm going to do is type up a lot of questions, and I believe that some of your questions would benefit from a kind of longer text response. So I'll put those on my website and kind of email Arvind, and you can look at them accordingly. But I did want to come back, if that's okay, on a question from Jacob Endara. I don't know.
Jacob, are you around?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, Jacob.
Sorry.
Yeah, because I saw from your question that you said, if Robin Hood does not like church officials, why does he like the king so much in the jest? Would the king not be as corrupt as the church in this time, or does this trait say something else about how people view the king in relation to the church during this time? I think a very good answer to that question is probably I'm going to defer to Eric Hobsbawm here, whose kind of thesis on this I'm quite convinced by. So in a book called Bandits, originally published in, I believe, 1969, but revised, I think, in the 1990s. Essentially, although churchmen are heavily criticized in many of the Robin Hood texts, for Robin Hood, and in fact for many bandits since, the king has always been seen as the fount of impartial justice, and this is one of the reasons why high outlaws such as Robin Hood always pledge loyalty to the king, because they're seen as apart from the kind of local structures of justice with whom the outlaws and the common people would have had to deal on a day-to-day basis. So yes, I mean, I would say in relation to that question, but Eric Hobsbawm has probably nailed the answer there for you. It's the fact that the king is always seen as an impartial arbiter of justice, and it is the monarch who can usually determine whether the outlaws are being worthy of being pardoned. So the same, I mentioned the story of the other medieval outlaw, Adam Bell, and of course the same thing happens at the end of that one as well. Adam Bell is pardoned by the king, but they specifically go to the king because they know they're not going to get justice from the local officials, but they will get it from the king.
Oh, thank you very much. I was just curious about those power structures, so thank you for elaborating on that.
Pleasure.
I just had a quick follow-up. Since Stephen, you said king, and I certainly understand that the image, of royal justice is certainly invoked when the king is presented as the arbiter of justice that is looked up to. But I wonder about the king. Sometimes the king is identified with Edward. I wonder which Edward are we talking about, or is it one of the three Edward, four Edwards? It's always confusing to me where we are. I know this has been asked several times. I just wondered what your view might be.
So I need to give credit to my friend here, who I think has come up with the most convincing explanation for this. I'll type his name in the chat, and he wrote a monograph recently. So his Mark Truesdale, a wonderful friend. His monograph was on specifically those kinds of tales where a medieval king ventures among the common people, which of course included the Robin Hood text as well. But his theory, and I hope I'm doing it justice here. It's been about 2 years since I actually read it in full now. But his theory is that essentially Edward was kind of a catch-all name for a royal personage. So it didn't necessarily matter which Edward was being represented in the text, but you know, it essentially also makes I think, and here's where I beg Mark's forgiveness if he sees this recording, but essentially it makes it makes those texts pretty timeless at the same time. So you know, if they are being, if the Jest of Robin Hood, for example, is being read in 1495 when it's first published, or if it's being read in 1550 when it's published later, everyone will, presumably the readers or listeners will be aware that you know, actually this is just a generic name for a king, and could be any kind of medieval king, so to speak. But then I think Mark Truesdale builds on that as well, because he says this highlights one of the issues with trying to tie some of the events of the ballad with actual people, because you know, although although we have the most likely candidate for a real Robin Hood appearing in 1225 in court records, you know, the events of that man's life likely bear no relation to what appeared in the late 1400s and the stories about him. So yeah, I mean, Mark Truesdale's answer to that would be that it is generic name for king.
Thank you. That was really good. We'll certainly look up that dissertation. Is that a PhD dissertation or?
And now a published monograph, actually.
Oh,
yes.
Great. Okay, so I'll certainly get hold of it. All right, so let's have a few more questions. I think, unless Stephen, you're tired and you want to leave.
Oh, no, I'm fine.
Yes, Evan.
All right. Thank you for speaking. I've got a question that isn't too tangential to what we've been talking about. It might actually add a dimension to it. On page 14, you talk about the sentence of outlawry, and you say essentially that, quote, the social and legal system of England was changing from one that was based upon the exclusion and summary punishment of felons to one which increasingly favored custodial sentences, unquote. And we're talking about how the sentence of outlawry had lost a lot of its teeth, and the general attitude towards justice had moved from this exclusion and punishment to these custodial sentences. I wanted to know what precipitated that shift in the reigning legal philosophy, and what kind of implications it might have had for the legend of Robin Hood. Because what I've noticed in reading the legends is that a large part of his mystique and of his appeal is that he is an outlaw, that he's socially outcast, and he's always running this risk of being hunted and being a fugitive and being on the run from the law. So it seems that the dominant form of crime and punishment, moving away from outlawry and towards something less representative of his character, would lessen the impact of the Robin Hood legends, or maybe just detach him completely from the real world.
Yeah, I actually made a couple of notes on your question when I was reading it earlier. So to kind of raise 2 points first. So I would say when you asked about, you know, what precipitated the shift, first of all, but by even the early 1400s, the state is much more organized, if you will. You know, for example, the king, especially by the kind of 1490s when the Jest is being published, the king is no longer itinerant. So he does not travel around the country personally hearing and adjudicating in certain cases. Instead, he's leaving that to local officials. So first of all, you have a kind of further organization of the state. You have a kind of better, although there's no police force, you do also get the growth of constables and night watchmen. So you do have better enforcement of the law, certainly by the very late 1400s. I think there's a general idea that actually it is not enough just to declare someone an outlaw. The state kind of has to deal with these people, and you know, this is part of a kind of you know, it is part, you know, it's a conscious decision, perhaps, but by some state actors, because you know, you are by taking responsibility, even for like kind of reprobates and felons and that, you are of course increasing your power. So I think that's kind of the first thing. Now, does this remove a part of the mystique of being an outlaw? So yes, I mean, what I would say in response to that is that essentially the Jest, I think they should be viewed almost like historical fiction. So if you have purchased the pamphlet of the Jest of Robin Hood in 1495, or especially by 1560, it is the, I mean, kind of to invoke a pop culture reference, you know, it's the equivalent perhaps of us I don't know, watching a period drama from you know, set 200 years ago or something, when you know, a King George was on the throne or whatever. So I think within the text itself, you know, if people were listening or reading a tale such as the Jest, they would have known that there would perhaps have been a general sense that actually we are learning about a tale which, you know, is set in bygone times, perhaps. So I think those were the ideas I had on that, which I think probably do tally a bit with what Mark Truesdale says about, you know, the monarch just being a kind of unnamed and unnumbered King Edward, you know. So essentially, yeah, I mean, I would say the world of the Jest of Robin Hood is certainly perhaps 1200s or very early 1300s, but of course it was produced in the 1400s, so to speak. So yeah, I don't think within the text itself it takes anything away from Robin's outlawry, but certainly in wider society, readers and listeners would probably have been aware that actually we do not have these people anymore, you know. So yeah, but I like that question. Thank you. Well,
Thank you,
like
Mr. Basdeo. Thank you for elaborating.
Other questions? Anyone who's in response to the talk itself? If you have any, just raise your voice and there's one, Chris, I think, has sent me a note. Chris, do you want to unmute yourself and raise the question? Okay, anyone else? I'm surprised. I mean, they've it's maybe I'd actually marked a few questions which I submitted to Stephen, and maybe I can call on Sarah around. Sarah had a question on Maid Mary. Yes, so Sarah, do you want to pose your question? Because we saw a picture of Robin Hood, the Earl of Huntington. I think let's have Sarah pose that question on the Maid.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
I realized I worded my question really badly. So looking at it in retrospect, I'm going to reword it. I
Okay.
was, when I started reading the Jest of Robin Hood, that was my first Robin Hood text. And my only experience was like the film, the Disney film. So I assumed the Mary referred to there was like Maid Marian. And I was wondering if Robin Hood tends to refer to the Virgin Mary in a very familiar manner, using her as like security for his the debt the knight owes him. But I was wondering, is the Virgin Mary some sort of influence on the figure of Maid Marian? I think in your introduction you mentioned that she isn't actually based on a real figure, but I was wondering if she was based on a religious figure in any way.
There are some scholars who argue that, and I can see why they make the connections between the Virgin Mary and Maid Marian. For me personally, I think that it is perhaps a little bit too, what's the word? Perhaps teleological, perhaps, we have these kind of, we have the Virgin Mary in early texts, and then they all converge and end up as this figure of Maid Marian. I mean, my own personal opinion on that, and it's perhaps something you could. I think Stephen Knight takes the view that actually, the Virgin Mary does metamorphosize into Maid Marian, but my own personal view is that the two are separate, and that there may have been some influence, but I think sometimes the connections between them can be a bit overstretched, so to speak, especially when we do have a kind of a woman Marian figure in 1282 in the Jeu de Robin et Marion, who is a Marian all in herself, and who is a kind of clear and direct influence on later Maid Marian interpretations. So yeah, sorry, that probably hasn't answered your question, and maybe I'll pass the book a little bit by saying read Stephen Knight, who does think that the Virgin Mary becomes Maid Marian. But yeah, personal opinion is that there may be a tenuous link, but still Maid Marian is a separate fictional character, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Sarah's just. There were three questions that Claire, Michael, and John. I think there were a few others, but these three stand out. The myth of Robin Hood as giving to the poor. The question is, how did this come about? And given this is not the historical Robin, I hope I'm trying to draw on all three and make one question in the interest of time. But basically, the emergence of this myth of the charitable, Christ-like Robin Hood, and not the Robin Hood we've encountered thus far in the Guests and a number of other legends. Yes, that's the. Oh, I've been signed out.
No, I think you're still in.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I got signed out from. I don't understand what happened, but I've been signed back in. So go ahead, please.
Yeah. So how did the myth come about? Well, I think there's definitely something in the claim that it was the village May Day celebrations and the other charitable events. There also used to be events which were called Robin Hood Ales as well, where kind of beer would be passed around, and again, usually these events would be held for a good cause in local villages and towns. So I think Stephen Knight is right to say that that's where the idea emerged. Of course, on top of that, we do get hints of, at the very end of the jest, we do get the hint that Robin Hood was, he, quote, did poor men much good. And I think that's kind of in the final 4 lines of that poem. I mean, the question would then become, I guess, well, was it the medieval play games which then influenced the insertion of those few lines into the text of the jest at the very end, when it was published in 1495? But as for kind of its persistence into popular culture, it remarkably didn't actually, if you look at you know, especially at some of the 17th century sources, so Ben Jonson's The Sad Shepherd, for instance, which I think I cover kind of briefly in my book, that there's nothing in there. And certainly by the time you get to the early 1700s, with Robin Hood as who begins to feature in true crime literature like histories of highwaymen and the Newgate calendars and publications like that, it has almost completely vanished. And it is really when Ritson restarts everything really in 1795. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in kind of bumps and starts really, you know, but there's hints of it in medieval sources, and then it disappears for a while, and then you know, it comes back in the late 18th century, because of Ritson and his research, who because it was so authoritative and he claimed to kind of lay down the facts of the legend, quote unquote, it becomes the accepted norm that, oh, Robin Hood, he stole from the rich and gave to the poor, so to speak.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anyone else? Any of the guests who are attending? Louis, Guerra, any question to ask? Please just raise your voice and unmute yourself. Or anyone else?
I can ask a question.
Yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, so I in mine mentioned, or like was thinking about, you write that Robin Hood's return to like being an outlaw after he's in the king's court is the first literary portrayal of what criminologists today would call recidivism. Mm-hmm. And in light of that, I was wondering like if you could elaborate maybe a bit on like what maybe his return to outlawry would indicate, I don't know, in a modern like psychological or sociological standpoint, considering you like bring up this somewhat modern term to describe that behavior.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I should preface this by saying, first of all, I'm not a psychologist, so please, these will be very kind of educated speculations, but speculations nonetheless. But we obviously know, at least by the time the jest is published, that that Robin Hood, especially in the jest, is viewed as a kind of a figure of freedom. You know, he's essentially a free man, free from the kind of strictures of the world, kind of living apart in essentially his own independent society, you know, in the forest. And so I mean, and this is where kind of we can maybe put an alternative interpretation on the king traveling to see him at the end of the jest, because while Robin does kind of pledge loyalty to the king, he on the king's part, I've always felt that this is more keeping your friends close and your enemies closer, and if you cannot control the outlaw, you can at least keep him as close as you possibly can. So I've always felt that the king essentially perhaps forcing maybe Robin Hood to return with him and serve in his court is almost like a prison sentence, even if it's quite a gilded prison sentence, we might say. But of course, we've earlier in the text, such as the jest, we have a Robin Hood who has enjoyed freedom and who has been essentially, perhaps he's in his own way a kind of monarch figure himself. He's sometimes called, in fact, in some later interpretations, the king of the forest. And I think it is the rules-based life that he finds unpalatable. He does not want to be part of the court. He does not want to be subordinate to the king. He may pledge loyalty to the king, but pledging loyalty to the king and wanting to be his complete subordinate and his daily servant is entirely another matter. So yeah, I think he returns to being an outlaw just to kind of regain that sense of freedom, really.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like I was also thinking too about you kind of talked about like Robin Hood's, like class and how like this is maybe in his own way like forcing some division with the king. Like he wants to be something of a victim, maybe, like, so he has some kind of, I don't know, purpose, like something to go up against. Whereas like if he's in the court of the king, like right, like you were saying, like he's just kind of subjected to whatever the king has him do. Yeah, so thank you.
A pleasure.
Stephen, I fear I've far exceeded the limit I had. I don't want you to be angry with me, and
No.
11, 20, 16 there. And I was wondering, I know you have to go to bed, and I was just wondering, you very kindly, very generously offered to respond to my students' questions. If you prefer, you could address those questions orally without having to write them down another time. If you're free next week or so, I can let you know, and we can talk about this. If you want to just log on and just do a Q&A rather than painstakingly writing all the answers. And I don't want to.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind writing, but I will also I think if I come back and kind of address people, I will also be able to go and make a few more detailed notes, which are which are perhaps more robustly supported, because I can go away and look things up as well. Yeah. So, but no, I mean, there were some really good questions. But when I got them through, I thought, wow, this is like my Viva for my PhD. So some very intelligent students you have, I must say.
We have to thank them. I can't take much credit for this. So let's do it this way. I'll let you suit yourself. If you want to come back maybe next week, or whenever on either a Monday or a Wednesday, we have a class at the same time. And we can return to the questions, because many of my students are going to be working on Robin Hood for their final projects. Because I don't want to keep you. I know we had decided on about 20 minutes, and I far exceeded that limit. And I want you to go to bed, and then we can resume when you're fresh and when you've revisited the questions, or as you say, consulted the sources.
Yeah.
So allow me to thank, let us all thank Stephen at the moment, and let's hope we thank you very much. And
thank you very much.
I'll send you the recording as well.
Thank you.
Okay, I will stop the recording, and I know I'm going to log off and then log on in about 5. I'll give you guys a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and continue our class. Okay, so don't go away. I mean, my students.